Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Tom Keating, and I'm Director of RUSI's Centre for Financial Crime and Security Studies here in London. It's my great pleasure to be the moderator of today's webinar, co-hosted by Cifas and RUSI's Centre for Financial Crime and Security Studies. I'll save the introduction of Cifas to our first speaker, Amber Burridge, in due course. But for those of you who do not know RUSI's Centre for Financial Crime and Security Studies, we established this program in 2014 with the aim of studying issues at the intersection of finance and security, including operational and policy responses to new and existing financial crime threats and challenges, such as today's webinar topic, the COVID-19 Fraud-Organised Crime Nexus. This is a webinar that we feel is well timed for a great many reasons, least of all because I'm sure you have all listened to last week's Home Affairs Select Committee evidence session involving Commander Karen Baxter of the City of London Police and Graham Bigger of the National Economic Crime Centre. It's well worth investing 90 minutes in listening to that, not just for the insights into the specific COVID-related fraud issues, but in my experience, it seems to be a very frank analysis that both witnesses provided of the extent to which the UK falls short on tackling fraud, the largest reported crime type in the UK. This webinar is also well timed as it comes at the beginning of a new project we are working on at RUSI in partnership with Cifas that considers fraud within the UK's national security dialogue. So if you'd like to know more about that project, then do please get in touch with us. More generally, if you'd like to know more about our work and stay in touch with our publications and events, do please follow us on Twitter at CFCS_RUSI and sign up to our mailing list via the RUSI website. So before getting on with the show, I would like you please just briefly to absorb the housekeeping points on the screen. Please note the full webinar, including the Q&A section, is being recorded. If you want to ask a question, please pose it in writing in the Q&A box, and please do include your name and organizational affiliation to help us give a sense of where you're coming from. So if I could ask our panelists to turn on their videos. And I can now take the opportunity to introduce our speakers. We're joined by a group who are right at the center of considering the issue of COVID-19 and fraud at the moment. So Amber Burridge is Head of Fraud Intelligence at Cifas. Sarah Pritchard, Director of the National Economic Crime Centre. David Clark, Chairman of the Fraud Advisory Panel and Chair of the COVID-19 Fraud Watch Task Force. And Nigel Kirby, Head of Group Financial Intelligence Unit at Lloyds Banking Group. I won't say any more about them now because I'm sure they will explain more about their responsibilities and experiences in due course. So our speakers will share remarks for about 7 minutes before we open the floor for Q&A from our online attendees. So again, please do remember to post your question in the Q&A box and we will do our best to answer those. So with that preamble done, thank you again for joining us, and I'd now like to turn the floor over to Amber for her opening remarks.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. It's quite exciting to be part of this forum, actually, to really talk about the issue that is a growing problem, not just for us, but globally as well. So for those of you that don't know who we are Cifas. We are a not-for-profit organisation, which essentially are made up of over 500 different members, and these stem from about 13 different sectors. So our members incorporate banks, insurers, retailers. We've got public sector in there as well. We've also got the telecoms industry. And essentially who we are is we like to sort of support in terms of fraud prevention. So essentially we house the National Fraud Database, to which our members will file cases of fraud that they have investigated. But we're not just a database, we're also an intelligence community as well. So we share the intelligence that we're seeing from a fraud perspective in terms of the fraud risks, and also the kind of situations that actually might be coming down the line. So a little bit of horizon scanning there as well. And I think what is really interesting to see at the moment is how fraud is evolving, and particularly with the current situation. So before I move on to that, I just wanted to set the scene a little bit. Sort of Tom mentioned at the beginning about the kind of scale of fraud. And I think what we saw definitely is an increase in the number of frauds recorded by our member organisations last year. Essentially, we saw an 18% increase in the number of cases recorded, so over 364,000 cases of fraud. Now, if you think about it, it's such a huge number, but actually those are the ones that are reported, and I think that is the thing we need to be aware of, particularly at the moment with the current situation in terms of reporting levels. For a lot of people, with some of the sort of attacks that have gone on at the moment, they won't know that they are a victim of fraud until a little bit later down the line. So it's very much worth bearing that in mind at the moment. The main issue that we see, without a doubt, is identity fraud. Identity fraud accounts for about 60% of the cases that we see, and our members actually have currently on our database 1.8 million cases of fraud, and 60% of that is identity fraud. It's such a vast number. And the other area that we're seeing an increase in is facility takeover. So essentially where someone's account has been taken over by another individual who will then abuse that account. That went up 34% last year compared to the year before. And the particular reason for that that we see is that actually the internet, technology and social media are key enablers for the types of fraud that we see and that get recorded to our database. Now, it's quite a key aspect because if you think about it, in the modern world, we are more digital. I mean, look at what we're doing now. Actually, it's online. But that also carries with it a degree of transparency around the data that is out there about us, which anyone could use to apply for products. I think the other thing that we're seeing at the moment is particularly around phishing, smishing, twishing apparently is another thing as well, where essentially people are sitting on Twitter handles and, say for example, you tweet your bank and you think it's your bank responding to you, there are people that are sitting out there to kind of take over that handle and actually message you back and take the conversation offline. So I think some of the things that we are seeing, particularly at the moment, which are kind of the COVID-related aspect, is that, there are threats to people working from home. There are threats to businesses. And at the moment, criminals are using that to their advantage. So essentially, taking advantage of those working from home at the moment, using platforms like this, video conference calling, for an example, we've had intelligence to suggest that there are numerous kind of phishing attacks at the moment where you might receive a notification saying that your webinar is about to start. And, they're kind of taking the advantage that potentially you're attending a lot of these at home at the moment. So actually, what are the chances that you'll click on that link to try and log in? And actually, it's a spoofed web page that you're trying to log into, and they will steal your credentials that way. Another thing that we've seen quite a bit in terms of the intelligence that we've received is around business email compromise. It was a big thing before COVID. However, obviously, with everyone working from home, you now got a bigger target audience that you can go to. I mean, I had it myself where I questioned it, where I received like an Amazon voucher from my CEO and I was like, is this real? Is this legitimate? Sent him a separate email just to check. Because actually it's things like that where they say, oh, you can claim your gift by filling out this survey. We've seen NHS workers targeted with free seminars on how to tackle the COVID epidemic. Sign up for this free webinar and actually they're giving away all their personal information through these types of attacks. And I think what I would ask you today really is, if you're talking to your colleagues, is just be vigilant of the things that are coming through to your email inbox. Do be vigilant of particularly video conferencing invites as well. I mean, it's kind of best practice. Make sure you've got a password if you're holding a meeting yourself and that you give to participants, just to ensure you haven't got anyone joining that shouldn't be joining. There is also the aspect in terms of the insider threat at the moment. And I know it's a few concerns that our members have raised, because obviously you've got a lot of people working from home with access to a lot of personal sensitive information at the moment. So actually, in the new normal, how do you enforce kind of monitoring tools to look for behaviour that is outside normal working hours? Because I have to put my hand up and say, I don't think I've really done normal hours since this has all happened, in all fairness, but that's the profession that I'm in, to be fair. It's how do we actually ensure that our members of staff won't be tempted to kind of go down that route? What check-ins are we doing with staff, not like from a well-being point of view, but also in terms of what they have access to. What are they doing? Who do they live with? Because obviously it might be, you're doing something on your computer, you walk away to make a cup of tea. Well, what if you're in a house share, for example, and you're working in the kitchen because that's where you've got the best Wi-Fi? There might be someone there that's accessing data that they necessarily shouldn't be accessing. And that's one of the key concerns, actually, that some of our members have raised with us. But I think actually we're all vulnerable at the moment. And I think that's something that we need to bear in mind with the current situation, is that actually you know, we are all susceptible. If we receive an email offering us a kind of a test for COVID, at the height of COVID, you know, we were seeing quite a lot of these type of phishing emails going around. So what I would say is that, you know, at the moment, the way criminals are doing things isn't really different, but it's just pigging off the back of COVID. So actually, how can we make it more COVID related? Because that will get people's attention. You know, sending an email, a kind of phishing email to someone with the tagline of business continuity COVID-19. How many of us actually, given the current situation, might open that? And, you know, there's a file linked to it, which might distribute some ransomware. So I would say, before you open any link or any attachment in any email that you get, if you've got the opportunity to use the preview, use that, because that should pick up any malicious kind of attachments that you might have. I appreciate that I've kind of come up to my 7 minutes now. I could talk about this all day, but we do have other panelists. But if you do have any questions or you do want to raise anything, you know, let's get the conversation going. It's a good opportunity to do so.
Great, Amber, thank you very much. So yes, it's kind of exploiting people's heightened awareness to COVID-19 and indeed concern stemming from that awareness. So you've laid out sort of the current picture. So perhaps now we'll turn to Sarah Pritchard from the National Economic Crime Centre for the law enforcement view. Sarah.
Thank you, Tom. Firstly, I just wanted to say a really big thank you to you and RUSI for the opportunity to speak to you all today in what I think we all have to acknowledge is rather challenging and uncertain times. But I do hope that everyone on this webinar today, that they, your families and organisations are all staying safe and well. By way of introduction, I'm Sarah Pritchard, as Tom has said, and I'm Director of the National Economic Crime Centre, which is a multi-agency partnership housed in the National Crime Agency, which brings together regulators, prosecutors, law enforcement and the private sector to deliver what we call a step change in the response to economic crime. The core partners in the NEC are the City of London Police, HM Revenue and Customs, the Serious Fraud Office, Financial Conduct Authority, National Crime Agency and the Crown Prosecution Service. But we also work extensively with the private sector, primarily through the Joint Money Laundering Intelligence Task Force, JMLIT, which many of you will know was set up in 2015 and has over 40 financial institutions who are members, together with members now of the insurance, legal and accountancy sectors. As the National Economic Crime Centre, we have 4 priorities. The first is to better understand the threat from economic crime. The second is to drive an improved operational response and close any vulnerabilities that may exist. The third is to act as the central voice into government on the operational community's requirements on economic crime. And the fourth is to understand the capabilities that exist across the system. We're just about 1 year old, which is why I've spent a little bit of time just explaining who the National Economic Crime Centre is, because many of you may not yet know or be entirely familiar with who we are. Over the course of the next 5 minutes or so, I'll explain a little bit about what we're seeing collectively about the fraud and money laundering threat as a result of COVID, what we're doing about it, and then touching on the comments that Amber made, what we can all do to help fight the threat and protect ourselves. So firstly, the changing threats. Well, it's a sorry thing to say, but it's true. We know that criminals will look at any opportunity to adapt, and COVID is absolutely no exception to that. We have seen some changes to the way in which criminals have adapted, both in terms of fraud and money laundering, so that they can continue their criminal activity through this time. In terms of fraud, we've seen 3 main categories of fraud. The first, frauds taking advantage of COVID, such as frauds relating to fake COVID testing kits. The second, public sector fraud, or fraud against the various different government stimulus packages that are available. And then finally, the more traditional types of fraud that were being reported pre-COVID, and as Amber says, fraud being the most significant crime type that exists in the UK currently, with the latest figures being approximately 3.8 million reported incidents of fraud in the year to September 2019, last year. In terms of volumes, what we initially saw was that actually overall fraud victim reporting initially dropped by about 18 to 20%. But in the recent weeks, this has returned to pre-lockdown levels. In some areas, notably online purchase fraud, there are more victim reports than we had before. Some of that is obviously a change in the way that customers and people are spending money, with the vast majority of us living most of our lives online, as per this webinar today. COVID-related fraud represents approximately 2% of all reported fraud, and that's been relatively consistent throughout lockdown, but it has resulted in reported victim losses now of over £5 million. In terms of money laundering, as lockdown restrictions were put in place, we did see an impact on cash-based money laundering in particular, with criminals finding it difficult to continue their previous activities. But again, this is now returning to relatively consistent and normal levels as criminals adapt their methods and as lockdown restrictions ease. Through the suspicious activity reports that we receive as part of the UK Financial Intelligence Unit, which is housed in the National Crime Agency, we're seeing consistent themes. So we're seeing increasing numbers of reports of the suspected abuse of the fiscal stimulus packages. This may be concerns arising from the lack of available material to support the existence or the legitimacy of claiming businesses. It may be rapid cash withdrawal or onward transmission of funds. It may be accounts that have been very recently opened simply to accept payments as a result of such schemes. We're seeing reports of cash deposits into businesses that we would expect to be closed under COVID lockdown. So of course there are concerns there that they may be used for money laundering purposes. And there are some potential cases of money laundering using greatly increased international trade in PPE as cover. Overall, there's been no change in the volume of suspicious activity reports that have been submitted throughout lockdown. So relatively consistent in terms of what we have seen pre-COVID and currently. And then, as Amber said, there are much broader concerns as well. So we know that there are concerns about the risk of insider trading and the risks of internal fraud with a workforce which is now substantially working at home. In terms of the future threat, we are also worried about an increase in investment fraud. Certainly post-2008 financial crisis, investment fraud was something that we saw significantly increase, and we expect a similar trend now. So crucially, what are we doing about it and how are we responding? Within law enforcement, under the umbrella of Operation Otello, which some of you may have heard about, we've set up a specific law enforcement response to COVID fraud named Operation Etherin. Working with the City of London Police, the National Economic Crime Centre has been working with law enforcement and other partners to ensure that we understand the threat, that we take action, and that we give protective advice and messaging to help prevent some of these frauds in the first place. Part of that has involved setting up a new central hub on the gov.uk platform with other government partners, where we're bringing together the various different places where fraud, protect and messaging advice is given. To make sure that we have the best feed of information coming from the private sector, we've made some changes to the suspicious activity reporting processes. It may seem small, but actually it's a crucial step. We've introduced a new glossary code for reporters to use so that COVID-related SARS can be really quickly identified as soon as they're submitted and then dealt with appropriately. We're also issuing regular comms out to the members of the regulated sector so that we can report on the trends that we're seeing through suspicious activity reports. And then finally, we have planned a new public-private partnership called the COVID Fusion Cell, which we have launched post-lockdown together with some of those on the webinar today in order to share information on the threat, identify opportunities for disruption, and inform the broader comms and protective advice that I've been talking about. This cell, it truly is a joint initiative between the National Economic Crime Centre and the private sector. We involve banks, insurers, trade bodies, and broader elements of the financial sector, as well as law enforcement and central government. Crucially, it's not just about sharing information for information's sake. Whilst that's really important so that we can all understand the threats, it is there in order to drive an operational response. This may be law enforcement outcomes, it could be arrests, asset denial, asset seizures, but equally it may be steps that the private sector can take to close any vulnerabilities, update their alerts and typologies, etc. The cell is starting to take referrals and develop casework. We're using it as a mechanism for sharing alerts, and we're sharing the weekly themes coming out of suspicious activity report data. As I said, this really does build on what the Joint Money Laundering Intelligence Task Force has been doing since 2015. But crucially, we're seeking to operate that model in a much more real-time and dynamic way, exchanging information weekly to make sure that there is a weekly understanding of the threat and looking at opportunities for disruption. So my final bit, just in terms of intro, very much building on what Amber says, and no doubt what many of the other panelists will say, is we are all able to take some steps to protect ourselves from fraud. We will all know someone who's a victim of fraud. We will all maybe even personally have suffered. As I said, it is the most common crime type in the UK. And whilst the law enforcement response is really important, we will not arrest our way out of this threat alone. So as individuals, just some very basic messaging. As Amber says, think very carefully about clicking on any links. Think really carefully before you hand over your money or personal details. And crucially, if you do think that you've been scammed or defrauded or experienced cybercrime, please do report it to Action Fraud, which is the UK's National Reporting Centre for Fraud and Cybercrime. And if you want to have a look at the gov.uk website, which brings together a hub of various different organisations which provide advice on this, please do have a look at the gov.uk site for coronavirus fraud and cybercrime. Thank you, Tom.
Great, Sarah, thank you very much. I already have several questions, but I will keep those until we finish, in case they're answered by David or indeed Nigel. So, David, I will pass the floor to you and your slides.
Good afternoon, and I'll echo the same comments. Thanks ever so much, RUSI, for pulling this together. I'm David Clark. I'm the chairman of the Fraud Advisory Panel, and we also set up sort of 12 weeks ago on lockdown the COVID-19 Fraud Watch group. Just to give a bit of background to that, there's nothing mysterious about it. We are a charity. We've got 2 members of staff, all the board, myself included, our volunteers, and our job, we are the voice of the counter-fraud community. We counter-fraud professionals across sectors, and we lobby, we train, we do research. We've been around for 22 years. We're established by the Institute of Chartered Accountants of England and Wales, and that's where we're actually based, not far from my office and my day job. And we set up the COVID-19 Fraud Watch to bring in lots of other sectors, not to duplicate what law enforcement have got. We do have NFIB, City Police, the NEC, and also Cabinet Office give us a standard briefing. We do it on the Chatham House, and it's got 2 clear objectives that I wanted there, which is get information and advice, good practice out to sectors and industries that often don't see it. I'm a former cop, used to be the head of the National Fraud Intelligence Bureau, had 30 odd years as a policeman investigating all manner of crimes. One of the things I know is we respond really well, but very often it's those on the periphery, other sectors don't always get picked up. So this is to get the information out to them, and 2-way, get information in. So we've been encouraging the sharing of information, sharing of intelligence. We pass that through to Cabinet Office, to the NFIB, and we make sure we collect it in there, and then we have a weekly bridge call on Thursday. It's again tomorrow morning, 45 minutes, we get a briefing note, and a sanitised version of that gets out across international networks. And I'm hugely grateful to all the diverse partners, British Chambers of Commerce, Law Society, Department of International Trade and others, Security Institute and so on, who are all getting that message out together. And this is what I've been so impressed with across the agencies, is fantastic, pulling together at the time of, you know, first in a century time of danger for the world and for British interests. So absolutely, absolutely fantastic to see that. Kind of things have already been covered, what we've been seeing. We've been getting direct information and actionable intelligence in, which we pass through as fast as possible. In fact, we ask people to direct it straight to the NFIB if they see this. And some of the things that you've just heard about came through our group, through our network. I won't say who they are, but trends identified, and lots of things being seen. So kind of things there, as we heard, diversion. Checks are being abused again. People sending checks, unusual. Phishing emails, of course, you saw that straight away. The risks around people remote working, we've got a lot of things, stuff I've been doing with the Chambers of Commerce International. How do we make sure people are at home safe? And particularly, I think I haven't heard a lot of, but you might want to think about, I've done this with my company, is physical safety. If you sat at home with kit, one of the webinars I was giving, I had a delivery, it was a courier bringing our annual accounts to be signed, you know. So one thing hacking in, remember the real world, those villains are out there coming up with some really cunning stuff, and they're using it as a hook. They'll be doing all manner of things. So we've seen those. Interesting, as you say, not a lot of reports, but just watch this space. I'm not a cynic, I'm an optimist. We'll get through this. We've got great networks, but there will be various things that will take slow burn before they come out. And you've heard there, procurement stimulus packages, things that we've picked up from our members, seeing transactions going to dormant accounts, small businesses. You've heard these in the press. Where's the due diligence? You know, Lonely Hearts, we've talked a lot about that with BBC over the years. There's some superb work that City Police and others are doing with the BBC, which will be a new set of programmes. But, you know, that's it. I mean, I helped a lady a couple of years ago, Elizabeth. She got the record, I think, giving 1.6 million to fraudsters. So what's the solution to these current ones? Sharing intelligence. We've got to really come together, put divisions and competition aside. Mass public awareness we've been calling for a long time, and a consistent message. The things that our members are saying is too many mixed messages. And I won't go into that, you know, the issues we've had across the nation and the regions with messaging around COVID. It's still the same with consistent messaging there. Thanks a lot. I'll move on to the next slide now. So what I'm more interested in, I'm sure you are as well, is anticipate emerging threats. You know, the Beebles and Seables, this is just a fantastic opportunity for criminals. I come at it from a funny place in that I'm not just chairman of the Fraud Advisory Panel and COP for 30 odd years and setting up the National Fraud Intelligence Bureau and so on. I was there and I was in the US at the time, 2006, at the time with the FBI, at the time of, you know, the pre-crash. And we were already seeing mortgage fraud, you know, so we also ran the Boiler Room Index. We were pushing for that side before City Police took the lead force. We had NFIB, we could see it. And you will see them now. They won't appear until afterwards, but they're busy. So things to watch out: boiler rooms, pension liberation. When you get in zero on your pension, people start panicking. They're susceptible to boiler rooms. Brits are brilliant at this, conning people over the world. Watch out for Phoenix companies. We've got lots of businesses in trouble. You know, if there's a chance to get a grant. The other thing I've got, I suppose, I'm a director in a business in the city, an international business, Queen's Award winner. I've applied with our team on all manner of grants and things, legitimately. And you know what? It's hard work, but villains would love this because they're so good at it. And the thing I think to be careful of are these two things. And, you know, and I'm sure NCA are already doing lots of work on this, but our other businesses, that's a rerun of the 2003-8 bank, you know, sort of lack of due diligence. We caught a massive cold there. You know, there's our book, Behaving Badly, from 2016. Read it. It's a scary read. Nobody went to jail. They did in the US. We had a $2 billion fine for a bank that the New York DA dealt with against a British bank 2 years ago. Have a look it up for mis-selling. But things we've got to watch out for are organised crime groups. You'll have seen a couple of weeks ago in Italy, they're looking for vulnerable companies to find basically mule companies, people desperate. Well, there's about 1 million British businesses out there, very good before. You won't pick them up, they were solid. They're now vulnerable, wanting money, and they can't get it, and they're fearful. That is just joy for some. And then watch out for commercial property. My favourite case, we did have a prosecution around some of the subprime type stuff. It was the SFO versus Kalakis and Williams. I won't go into it. They got away with 61 million, the most, you know, sort of audacious fraudsters. Read what the judge said in that ruling at Southwark Crown Court. You know, he said it beggars belief that the bank directors did not conduct due diligence and were happy with this. They didn't listen to warnings from in-house. Now, nobody went to jail apart from those two characters who had previous convictions. Were they on the Cifas database? Were they on the systems? No, but we lend them 750 million. So that aside, there are the areas that we've got to really watch out for. Commercial property, people with loans, businesses, fake businesses, how do you spot them? The solution, and I'd say we've been saying this since 2012 with data matching, government and business, we've got to have some transparency, and we've got to get things like the recipients of BBLs, CBLs, loans and grants out there published. Innovate UK do publish under their transparency rules, and you can see them there. We can data match. 35 billion has gone to 830,000 businesses with small grants. The BBLs, CBLs, slightly less than the BBLs, but they've been fast-tracked, rightly so. But 35 billion, that's a lot of things there going out quickly. How do we data match that? Some of this can be policed on its own. Should it be transparent? Well, the grants are. Everything should be, in my mind. Then we can data match. We can use big data analytics like we were using in City Police, but we really need to go for this. We will find the red flags that help us to claw back later. And that's the one area I think we've got to be so careful of. And if we're not using this and we're relying on, you know, someone else to do it, wait, what comes out, you know, 18 months from now will not be funny. And being a business owner and a counter-fraud professional, I want people to listen. I want the money to go to good businesses, not to crooks. And we've got to watch out for how we find those people. That's it from me. Thank you.
Great, David. Thank you very much. I have to say, as a former investment banker, I'm liking the discussion about the investment fraud that we have coming down the track. Not something I'd thought about, so perhaps something to talk about in the Q&A. But before then, last but by no means least, I'd like to turn the floor to Nigel Kirby of Lloyds Banking Group. Nigel, over to you.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you for the invite to speak today from the industry perspective. The title of this is very much Threats, Challenges, Responses, and I'm going to try and focus the next 7 minutes on the changes that we may have seen in those three titles. So the threats, the vectors of the threats, organised crime and potential opportunists, people that haven't been involved in crime before, I suggested the threats and the impact of those. Let's remind ourselves where the impact is. You know, from banking, it's on our customers, on members of the public that are our customers, retail customers, it's on our businesses and our commercial banks, and losses to them. For the bank itself, of course, the impact of that is on its security, its cyber security, its reputation as a bank, and of course, the finances of the bank itself and losses that it may accrue. Perhaps one of the biggest ones, the impact here is Treasury. We're all taxpayers, assuming we're all taxpayers, or most are on the call, and the amount of Treasury money there, they are potential victims of organised crime and some of the opportunity threats. And of course, the UK as a whole. Prior to this, economic crime reforms talking about UK being a safe and prosperous place to do business, legitimate business, picking up on Dave Clark's position, that's the threat. So what has changed there? I suggest actually not a lot. Organised crime is still out there. As you've heard from colleagues before, the format of the attacks are slightly different than CV9 theme, but they're there looking to exploit, looking to make money. I suspect, though, or assess that out there are more people that are being drawn into crime in relation to the opportunity there is around the government threats, government stimulus packages. So then let's look at the challenges of changing there. Actually, what's changed is the environment. I don't tell you on that. Since 23rd of March, lockdown. Since 23rd of March, huge government stimulus packages. You've heard about the packages from colleagues. I won't repeat them all now for the sake of time. And our critical infrastructure tested. So as Lloyds Bank employs 65,000 people and has the largest market share across the UK, huge challenge for us in keeping that vital service running. We have illnesses. We unfortunately had deaths, as you'd expect from a workforce like that. We've had challenges keeping branches open and keeping that service at a time when there's a huge increase for it, delivering the C bills, delivering the B bills, and delivering the transactions for the government stimulus packages. Huge challenge about home working and moving to tens of thousands of laptops and remote accesses for the bank. We're not the only one. I'm speaking, I'm sure, for many peer banks in this space. And added to that, the decisions we had to take quite quickly on the security. Dave mentioned it, working from home security, and the policies and procedures we had, having to rapidly sort of change our view on those so that we could provide a service from home. And yet, where the greatest challenge was, I know it's about organised crime, but I'd like to give credit to are those colleagues that were out there on the front line, providing those services in branches, day in, day out, providing them to the businesses, day in, day out. You know, it's a huge credit to them for doing that. And also for those colleagues who have to deal with bereavements. We've heard of 40,000 deaths in the UK linked to CV-19. You know, a large percentage of those we bank and other peer banks do. We've had to increase the amount of people we have to deal with that. So that's probably one of our biggest challenges. But Tom, I know RUSI's here about organised crime, not about banking and business. So I'll focus on the organised crime challenge here. As Sarah mentioned, cash generated. We saw less of that immediately after CV-19, but seeing that increasing. I think for us the biggest threat is the billions available for businesses through the government stimulus packages, particularly the C bills and the B bills. And the challenge is that tension between the natural, I guess, inclination of banks for due diligence and working through this and making sure that those loans are secure, but the understandable pressure there is from government and FCA to balance those financial crime risks with getting money in an expedient, quick way to those businesses. What we've seen in that case is exactly as Amber said, a recovery. We saw a drop in fraud within Lloyds across all areas immediately after CV-19, and seen it increasing with the slightly different themes that have been reported back. I guess our assessment will be that it's going to increase further as organised crime looks to exploit the situation at the moment, and as B bills and C bills are exploited. We've seen PPE, personal protection information, medical fraud diversions. We've seen cash going to accounts that really shouldn't. On Facebook, they're closed down, they're not doing any business, and yet they're putting tens of thousands through. So that's an area of risk which we've reported. And on the B bills, yes, we have seen an increase, not a huge increase, probably about 0.3% on our usual book rate of B bill fraud. But that's what we're seeing now. And as people have mentioned, there'll be some we see in a year's time when people have applied genuinely for them, but actually in their mind they have no intent of paying them back. I'll cover some cases later if we've got time. Responses, I think, is really important here. What's changed? So for us in Lloyds, the greatest response is the cross Lloyds coordination that we have done. Huge amount of information from government at the time, lots of different changing threat pictures from different bits of government, law enforcement and industry. So we pulled together in Lloyds across a large workforce about what we're doing, our understanding of the threat, and sharing that in the bank within a weekly intelligence summary. But we're using exactly the same document to share that back into Sarah's Fusion Centre, so that our learning is shared back into Fusion Centre. And what we're seeing is that Fusion Centre every single week, a dashboard of the threat from the public and private sector. We've never had that before. We've had strategic threat assessments, but not a strategic threat assessment that is iterative and builds on week in, week out. We use that a lot in the bank, and we use it on our private-public partnership calls every Friday. So that's different, and that's something we need to build on and learn and develop as we move forward. What I've also seen happen, and think to that, is regular reports from the UK FIU. We've tended to bash the UK FIU for not telling us what's happening before, but they've had a weekly report on CV-19 and what they're seeing, and that feeds into the dashboard, and that's useful. So thank you for that. And let's finish off with some operational tactical work. So being from law enforcement backfield, you can't take that bit out of me, Tom. So a couple of sanitized cases that we've seen and stuff we've done differently. In fact, I'll probably just touch on two because of the time here. So on one diversion fraud, we saw a alleged contract for medical equipment, and the position was thus that probably some of it was purchasing investment equipment, but 50% was being diverted elsewhere. The response was quicker than I've ever seen from private or public in terms of the sharing of information between law enforcement and three banks in this space. It wasn't weeks, it wasn't days, it was hours, and that actually meant that there was a decision taken quite quickly that resulted ultimately in about £2 million being returned to NHS Medical Trust. which I think is a worthwhile thing to happen. I obviously can't go into detail, but what I did see was I would like to see that speed of response and the energy from law enforcement and private sector working together that they have shown in GIMNet, but we sped it up and made decisions quickly in a difficult time, so we can learn from that. And the other thing we can, I think, learn from, again, in terms of speed in putting things through, is I mentioned about the cash chain, the cash deposits that we saw. Well, there was just one business, several businesses, but one of the businesses we saw that was actually ostensibly saying it's not trading, but was putting tens of thousands in cash through where it could, because we still have branches open, post offices were open, etc. People could deposit cash. When we looked at that, our assessment was the fact that it was still actively supplying materials for the drugs market to drugs manufacturers and growers. And in doing that, of course, we would have put a SAR in, that's what we need to do legally, but putting it into the diffusion centre gives the opportunity for law enforcement within that particular period, if they wish to go out there and potentially identify the customers who one would suggest are probably drugs suppliers, growers, etc. And again, that was done quicker and more directly than I've ever seen before. So it's just a couple of examples in there, Tom, amongst others, of things that we've done differently that we need to reflect on after this immediate crisis, to think, can we do that better as part of business as usual? Thank you for the opportunity.
Okay, Nigel, thank you very much. If I could now invite the other panelists to put their cameras on, and we'll start to take some questions. While you're doing that, there is one comment that's been made, which I will reinforce, which obviously, of course, fraud is not just about organised crime and economic crime, it's about the victims. And I make the point that we're having this discussion focusing on the kind of the organised crime and the criminal side of this, but we don't have this discussion in the absence of thinking about the victims. So I'll just cover that point now. So I'm going to abuse kind of home team advantage. There's a question from a colleague, Helena Woods. So we've sort of talked about how criminality has changed a bit, and Sarah, I'll ask you to have a first go at this, how criminality has changed a bit as a result of COVID-19. I think the specific question here is, obviously there are some forms of organised crime that have relied on international travel, like people trafficking and drugs trafficking. So I guess the question is, are we aware of, have we seen, would we expect organised crime groups to pivot towards perhaps fraud-based fundraising in light of the fact that their other sources of funding perhaps are more challenging at the moment because of the inability to travel and to transport?
Thanks, Tom. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
So I think what we can say is, actually at the beginning of lockdown, lockdown affected criminals as much as it did all of us. It was a massive and significant change to all of our lives, and it still is. So there wasn't an immediate pivot to other forms of criminal activity. I don't think we have yet, through the victim reporting, seen a more traditional OCG move into fraud, but we do need to acknowledge that the picture is evolving, and frankly, we're only, I lose track of the days, let alone the weeks, but we're about sort of week 10 or 12 of lockdown. What we have seen though is criminals who participate in cash-based money laundering, so traditional OCGs that are involved in the drugs commodity trade, for example. Some significant difficulties for them to start with to move their money around. The NCA and together with partners has seized over £50 million in cash since lockdown. So some significant seizures, and some of that linked to seizures that also have resulted in the seizure of significant quantities of drugs. It is more difficult to place your cash into the banking system in circumstances where many businesses are closed down, so you wouldn't be expecting cash deposits. It is more difficult to hide when the rest of the landscape around that has changed. So we've seen an easier ability to spot those OCGs that are involved in cash-based money laundering. Not yet, I would say, but I wouldn't place a high degree of confidence in that in terms of whether that remains the case. Not yet a major pivot to other crime types. But as we know, this is the reason that illicit finance and tackling the illicit finance threat is so important. criminals, whatever criminal activity they're involved in, will want to take the money, hide it, launder it, and then use it. So it's really important that we remain on top of understanding how criminals are changing their behaviour and then crucially tackling it.
Great, thanks for that. I think the next question I wanted to pick out was really about, and Amber, maybe I'll come to you first on this. It's really about the picture on fraud, and are we seeing more of certain types of fraud, less of other types of fraud? And I think also tied into that, obviously we've talked about, and we'll come back to this in a second, we've talked about the possibility for investment fraud looking forward. But obviously many people are unemployed, or if they're not unemployed, they are getting paid considerably less than they were being paid. So are we seeing any increase in fraud that might perhaps be driven by unemployment?
I think it's quite interesting at the moment in terms of the way, obviously, we do business has changed. Is obviously it means the way that criminals operate will change as well. And I think in terms of kind of the current situation with other types of scams that we see, like romance scams, actually, you know, I saw intelligence the other day of sort of someone purporting to be a nurse saying they needed money and actually tried to engage the victim that way. So, you know, in terms of seeing lesser volumes of other types of fraud, actually, no, it's pretty much for what we're seeing, it's actually kind of still going on as it was before. It's just those that are kind of COVID related are being picked out and kind of being heightened, if you like, by the current situation. I think what is quite interesting to see is kind of like sort of Sarah's talking about the cash-based money laundering and that side of things. Now, obviously, we are starting to see from a mule recruitment perspective, there are numerous adverts, but instead of asking for a particular type of account, so for instance, some of the times we used to see sort of adverts recruiting people with a fintech type of account because they're quite easy to open, they're quite quick to open, actually going for that business account. Now, why are they asking for business account? Because of the stimulus packages. Actually, it's part of building that profile in terms of having a business. We've seen local authorities being targeted by phishing emails, trying to get that kind of that business detail out so that they can then fraudulently apply for business loans, you know, that kind of thing. Sorry, not business loans, but the business grants side of things. So actually, we've already mentioned they take advantage of the current situation. So all these stimulus packages that are being offered are like gold dust to those that are less honest, shall we say, than the rest of us. And I also actually think that those that are kind of suffering at the moment in terms of, you know, they don't know if they're going to have a job, or maybe they've lost their job, they're being targeted as well by criminals. So for instance, posing as a kind of insurer and saying, oh yes, we've got jobs going, do you want to apply? Oh, but if you want to start your job, actually, we need you to kind of pay us to get you the equipment for you to pay, like for you to do your job. So they're being targeted as well. And some research came up quite recently around that demographic, actually, of those that are kind of currently in that situation where they don't have any money, or maybe they're kind of got less money than they want. They're looking for opportunities, but it's just checking that job offer is legitimate. And I know there is sort of the Safer Jobs website that people can go to get a little bit of advice on that, on kind of recruitment during this phase. But it is interesting because we did research last year around kind of people's attitudes towards certain sort of fraud scenarios, shall we say. And it was really interesting because money muling came out as the second most reasonable type of fraud. You know, letting someone else use your bank account. Well, at the moment, actually, if you're looking for an easy way to make money and someone approaches you, it's very tempting. Similarly, if you're working from home and people know you work for a bank, you know, if you're not sure, given the current economic climate, what your job status will be after that. Actually, if someone says to you, oh, actually, if you can like maybe just give me a little bit of information, or can you maybe change something on this account, it is quite tempting and it is very difficult at the moment. So I think actually the current fraud situation reflects that where we are economically, but also sort of socially as well. I think that's the thing. We're all isolated at the moment, which makes us all very, like I said, susceptible and vulnerable. And I think that's something we really need to kind of, if you've got colleagues, checking on them. But I think it is one of those things, actually, what are we doing for our staff, for our colleagues? And those that obviously are in that situation, what is the community around them at the moment? It's a worrying time. And I think, you know, we need to stay vigilant, definitely.
Okay, thanks. Nigel, you wanted to come in here as well, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Tom, because the question asked about the different types of fraud being impacted, and of course we have seen that, and there'll be certain types of fraud, such as the computer misuse, repair fraud, that we've seen go down, that you might well predict because a lot of that came from Southeast Asia. But one of the things I actually wanted to point out to colleagues and those on the conference here that's happened at the same time is the confirmation of payee approach that has come in at the same time of fraud. So for those on the conference, I'm sure you're aware of this. With all the major banks, what you've got is when you put in to your bank account the details of who you wish to pay, it comes up either confirming that the payee is correct, the account number, sort number, sort code and account number matches the name, or it doesn't, or is a part match. What I would say from that is that does particularly help in some types of fraud. So investment fraud, are you paying exactly who you tend to be? Purchase fraud, CEO redirection fraud, etc. Those confirmation of payee is looking like it's having an impact in that space. There's others, such as computer misuse and repair and romance, that it probably won't, because it's not designed around that. But my message out to people there is confirmation of payee is there for a reason. Don't just override it without thinking about it very, very carefully. If you, your family, your friends, etc., are not getting back the person you expect to be paying, be cautious about it. And if you get socially or attempt to socially engineer, what we're seeing at the moment, attempt to socially engineer, saying, well, don't use that name, just use another name, because actually that's what I would use, and just test it out. Or those kind of things from fraudsters, just be cautious about it. So confirmation of payee is there to help try to protect our customers, and I think that it will be complicated with COVID-19 and confirmation of payee at the same time to work out what's doing what. But it's a tool, it's there for a purpose. Pay attention to it, please. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Great point. So I wanted to turn now a little bit to thinking about more of the investment side, and Sarah, I'll come to you first, and then David, I'll come to you. You talked about the kind of public-private partnership that is operating, and there's a question here with regards to angel investors. So the question is, I'll just perhaps read it. How can financial institutions be more alert to criminal angel investors who bail out struggling companies by providing loans or capital in return for control, but obviously where the funds are from suspect sources? What sort of work can we do to think about the next phase of fraud, if you like, with financial institutions to try and prepare us for the inevitable investment fraud scams that we'll face?
Thanks, Tom. I think what you touched on at the end of that question is really important for us, is not just responding to the here and now, but actually how will this threat evolve? And as you talked, angel investors, I think there was another question linked to fraud through the fiscal stimulus packages. One of those questions that we've been asking ourselves is, how do we deal with the risks that will really clearly identify themselves when, for example, the loans are not paid back? We can take action now, but at a future date, it will be clearer for us to be able to identify the criminal activity. So we absolutely should be thinking now and in the future. I think on the specific red flag question, this is where the partnership working between private sector and public sector is so important. I think red flags and typologies is essential for the private sector. Nigel, in fact, might want to come in from a banking perspective on how it can assist, but translating what law enforcement know in terms of the threat into something that is then really useful in the private sector to spot transactions, to spot companies or individuals of concern, has been something that has been difficult to achieve. And that is something that we are working on in the Fusion Centre. I think the way in which the question was asked on the Q&A also had a link through to how do you identify those red flags and angel investors where the corporate transparency isn't very clear. And frankly, that is really difficult, which is why that is such an important part of reform, hopefully for the future. But I don't know whether Nigel wanted to just come in on...
Yes, Nigel, why don't you jump in, then David, I'll come to you.
Thank you. So in my intro, I spoke about the intelligence summary and the weekly sharing that there was. both ways. In particular, part of that has been the information from government departments on various loans about what the loans look like, what they'd expect to see and what they wouldn't expect to see. That's been really useful to us as a starting point, but then sharing back in where we have had success as an industry in terms of the sort of positive rates of hit on the reviews has helped us refine which controls work better than others, which indicators work, and there are a long list of indicators for each of the frauds. Far too many to go through here, but each is quite different in what we look at. And the other thing for us, which is again looking at what we've done, what we want to take forward, and we've got conversations this week, is about showing across industry what works and doesn't work. So this isn't in the space of competition law where a lot of our work might be. It's actually in tackling fraud. So, for example, we've come up with a particular indicator, which I'm not going to share on here and everything because it would be a fraudster's dream, really. But this week, and we've been discussing it, we've spotted a particular way of identifying fraud in one of the particular schemes that seems to be particularly effective. We're not going to keep that to ourselves. We're sharing it with peers in terms of that red flag to see what happens. And that's something that wouldn't have happened before. So they are important, but we've got to see the wheat for the chaff because there are so many indicators that you've got red, orange, purple, etc. flags. It's about pulling those through that are most valuable and have the greatest return rate, because you can't look at it all. And then finally, I think the other bit, just to run, we talk about red flags and typologies. We've learned through the Gymnith experience, and we're learning through this, that it's not just about sharing those typologies. Where we have moved forward to the UK, and I think we're leading, Tom, in this. In fact, I think you once told us that we were best thing to come out since the Beatles, if I remember rightly, with Gymnith in terms of the way we share, best thing to come out of the UK since the Beatles, I recall you saying. But it's actually the steps that we have made in the UK, public-private sharing of real entities, people that are actually doing it. So that as we spot those fraudsters that are impacting across the system, of course, Cifas is there for the known fraud space, but where we're looking at is where we have those suspicions at the moment, and law enforcement have those suspicions, that we can share that information to see what impact they're having across the whole of the industry. That's important. That's something we are building on and need to build on.
Great, thank you. And Nigel, thank you so much for listening to what I say sometimes, or at least remembering what I say sometimes. David, if we could just turn to you, there's a question which kind of is also related to sort of the post-COVID environment and in investment. We have an international audience online today. We even have Professor Michael Levy joining us from Wales, from Cardiff. And Mike asks, how are you planning for impact on fraud on the post-COVID recession? So I guess there's an element here of planning and thinking ahead and protecting, in government speak, for the future.
Yeah, that's a very important and a very good question from Mike. Mike always throws those great ones in with his vast knowledge of economic crime over the years. I go back to, we've got to learn from history, haven't we? The biggest financial crisis in history was 2007-8, caused by, and it's all in that book there, the Business Behaving Badly, about bad handling, lack of due diligence, lack of loans, giving loans out to people. The reason I said Kalakis and Williams, Kalakis was Kolakis, which he had his previous conviction in. The two financial institutions that the judge criticised, were just rushing to do deals. And equally, we will have a situation here. I would like to see, and I haven't seen a lot of it yet, where we have within the strategy, and this is the government private sector strategy, details about how do we deal with moral hazard. If we have a repeat of investment scale, industrial scale, organised crime, where a group are able to suddenly realise, I could flog all these and short them later, I could flog all this toxic stuff as AAA, and actually it's pretty rubbish debt, it may even be linked to property, I then have no transparency at all for several months, maybe a couple of years, at which I'm long gone. We've learned nothing from the past. What I think we should be doing now is, we know that from certainly Bloomberg this morning, we're talking what will happen in the US with the forecast bankruptcies and losses, the stimulus package. We can't keep away from another recession. But what I'm sure everyone's doing, we're looking at this when we're risk assessing, every client we deal with, is going back through history, look at it. There's a number of sites do that, but you do need the data. At the moment, the bank have got that. And I just said earlier, 830,000 loans, government-backed loans, going out to SMEs, large ones, small ones, and actually only having, I think the report that came out week before last was 8 case studies. Now I looked at those 8 case studies, thought, yeah, they're business, aren't they? Where's the other 829,000 businesses? I've got no problem when we've had grants. I know lots of other people I speak to say, you know what, just help me out. I'd love to have one of these grants. But we've also got, when you look at it, other things around. We still haven't got to the bottom of public records around property. So if I'm organised crime, like in Italy, what would I be doing? I'd be finding those companies that are weak, previous strong rating. I put directors in, I have the premises, and I just leverage up absolutely everything. And if I've got a lawyer and a banker, just like the noughties, if I've got the lawyer and the banker in my pocket, we can all do rather nicely in 2 ways of fraud. One is getting that cash stimulus and getting it out and then putting it back on the taxpayer. Or here's the other thing to look at, like 2007, I get rid of all that toxic rubbish that's sitting on my balance sheet with properties that are actually not really occupied, they're not really valued, all the Kalakis stuff, and look at what he owned. A lot of it hasn't been developed. That's where I'd be looking. I would like to see 2 things. Publication of that, and I'd be interested to know really, I suppose, from NCA and probably Nigel, your side, is what's your view on that? Because as a business owner and in a business network, I don't know of anybody who says, you know what, yeah, tell it. I know it's not on the public record as a security or debenture, the charge isn't there, but put it out, the same as Innovate UK. I know it's going to be a big old spreadsheet, and let society police itself. You'll start seeing a lot of things. Now that in itself would be a deterrent to people because we didn't do it before and it created moral hazard. We're in danger of doing it again.
So I'll turn to sort of data and information in a second, but there is actually a data question they've directed to you from Dan Stevenson of Durham County Council, obviously a world famous city after recent events. But the serious question is that obviously COVID Small Business Grant Scheme has been subject to national fraud in different councils. Is there a means by which there is data matching going on? In other words, are we siloing ourselves, I suppose, in such a way that I can hit Durham and then I can go off and hit somewhere else, and when Durham realise that who I am, how do I inform and match that data across different councils? Is there a mechanism for that sort of data sharing?
There is, and the world, we lead the world in this sort of work. It started with the Audit Commission work around the National Fraud Initiative, which still goes on. Local authorities get that. There's a group, can't remember the name of the firm, I think they're up in Manchester, they work on that data matching. And a typical example would be where you get the matching of small business. Currently you get the small business relief for business rates if you've got an SME, but you can't be claiming that in lots of places or where your amount goes over. That goes on already. What I'm saying, Tom, and I suppose it's a question to Durham, we've got a couple, in fact the Information Commission has currently got a couple of tribunals that are up at appeal for 2 local authorities, 2 cities in England, which are worth looking at. They haven't been decided yet as to why they're not publishing data, public data around vacant office relief. Now for all the legit businesses who pay, when 2 years down the road we look back to this event where we're speaking and say, oh yeah, we were all looking at that, but I never realised that organised crime would actually go and get all those businesses where there was no public record about the fact they had those offices. Then they put somebody in, then they'd have a friend and they'd get grants and disappear and we never see them. It can happen already, and we've got some great systems for doing that. I think, if I remember rightly, Durham and others all contribute, but there's 1 or 2 areas that, and even in London, that don't share the information. Now, I know the reasons why they're saying, but it's not all right for the other boroughs. Data. Yeah.
Okay, I'll try and squeeze in a few more questions before we end. Amber, you've got your fingers up, I think, to say something there. I want to also just ask you to think about a question as well in your next response, which is around the question of public awareness, and have we, do we have a good enough understanding of kind of what works with messaging and how best to disseminate messaging to the public?
So firstly, I kind of just want to quickly touch on the kind of local authority grant work. Obviously, we are working with Fusion Cell, and part of that is acknowledged by both public and private sector that both need to come together in terms of the issues that are happening there. And one of the interesting things that we're kind of getting from local authorities is, we're kind of getting some feedback from them, is that actually for a lot of the applications that they're getting, quite often they're from businesses that they haven't really dealt with before, because they're either so small that they've never had to kind of register for business rates, and then when they're coming along, they're saying, oh, well, we're so small, we didn't need to register with you anyway to let you know, kind of thing. So it's a very difficult space, and we're obviously working with Fusion Cell and with sort of partners that sit within that group, how to tackle that exact issue around people applying for grants. How can we get visibility of it across all the local authorities? And that is work that is sort of going on, so do stay patient, and hopefully you'll get an answer very soon, I'd like to think. In terms of the public awareness, this is kind of where we're also feeding into part of the Fusion Cell and sort of Ethereum, because actually it is that consistent message. We see it in the fraud prevention space a lot around different messages going out to victims in terms of, this is what you do if you've been a victim of fraud, these are the ways to stay safe. And I think actually having that more coordinated response within sort of the National Economic Crime Centre is helping to piece some of that together, because obviously you've got the gov.uk website, which obviously has some really great advice on there. The kind of Take 5 campaign as well, which is so relevant today, more than ever. And I think it's actually through working through that kind of Fusion Cell and Ethereum Cell, actually we are starting to coordinate our messages a little bit better, public awareness. I mean, I'm not saying that if you kind of aware of a fraud threat, you shouldn't let your customers know. Definitely do it. But I think it's also we need to make sure that we build our network with fraud prevention messaging and ensure that actually, say for example, Nigel's got some great advice that he's pushing out. Actually, why can't I push that out on behalf for him? And I think we need to get better at doing that. And I think hopefully this is one of the good things that's coming out of the COVID situation, is that we are aligning a little bit better with our messaging. And I think we'll see that coming forward. Particularly, there's been numerous adverts. We're kind of pushing things out on social. Everyone has a different audience. And I think that's what we need to bear in mind at the moment, is actually it's who your audience is and how you reach them. And I think that is happening, and we are getting a little bit better at being more aligned with that. So
talking of alignment, Sarah, I'm going to come to you. We've always been thinking quite domestically. Can you give us a sense of, obviously many of these fraud scams involve overseas originators, or certainly the funds are crossing borders. Is there a joined up response to fraud at this time? What role are places like Europol playing? What's the kind of the international connection picture?
Thanks, Tom. So I think it's really important to say that throughout lockdown and throughout this pandemic situation that we are in, law enforcement and the law enforcement partnerships that we have continued as normal. So our continued engagement with Europol, colleagues in the US, that all has continued without any significant impact. And that's really important for us, particularly in illicit finance funds flow internationally. It isn't all confined within the borders of the UK. I think there's just a couple of other things I'd touch on. So within this Fusion Cell that has been mentioned, we do have international banks, and they are very quick to point out that actually we do need to look at the international flows as much as domestically. The other element that we've touched on in the Fusion Cell has been, what can we learn from those countries in Europe that went into lockdown earlier than we did and have come out earlier? Can we start to see through perhaps some of the private sector members of the cell changes in the activity that have been seen as lockdown restrictions ease in Europe, so that we can plan for them? It may only be a few weeks ahead, but still planning a few weeks ahead is important. And so we've begun to have some of those discussions, taking the learnings from some of our private sector partners that have got a footprint in European nations where the lockdown position is slightly different. But you're absolutely right. It is important that we don't only act domestically. And I'm pleased to say that from a law enforcement perspective, the pandemic hasn't downgraded the existing cooperation that we have. And actually, we've started to talk about that international element, bringing in the international expertise from some of those in the cell.
Great. Okay, well, we're unfortunately coming to the end of our time. I'm going to close, if I may. Sorry, I didn't warn you in advance about this, but you're quick thinking people. If you could just perhaps posit a couple of things that you would like to see happen as we think about fraud right now, particularly given the environment we're in. What are the couple of things that you would like to see happening, so that when we look back in 6, 9, 12 months time, we say, okay, we got ahead of the challenge, and the next time Graham Bigger or Commander Baxter are sitting in front of the Home Affairs Select Committee, they can be reporting a strong response to fraud during this period. So I'm going to give the last word to Amber as the co-host. So I'm going to start, if I may, Nigel, with you, as you're in the top left of my screen.
Okay. Thanks, Tom. Thanks for the warning. Okay. So 2 things you asked for. Sharing suspicious information and joint planning. Let me say just a little bit more about that. Where there is known and proven fraud, we successfully share that through Cifas at the moment, and the industry can see it, the public can see a lot of that. Where we're not sharing at the moment is where we have suspicions of fraud or of money laundering at the moment linked to this, and we need as a country, as an industry, to get to a place where we can more effectively share our suspicions of where there is crime that's impacting on our customers, on our industry, and our country. And that's a tough one, but it's an important one. I think is a game changer. And then the one that the second point from that is moving forward and learning that we've done. We've built the information sharing that we have at the moment. If we can take that to joint planning, so that actually when we decided that there needs to be a response, we work through a response that is really joined up from a private and public perspective. It's not just about law enforcement and private as an afterthought, or vice versa, private doing a load of protect stuff and then having it as law enforcement. So a better coming together of, we understand the threat, we understand the problem, and now we've actually got a shared agreed plan on how we're going to tackle it. 2 things.
Great, thank you. Sarah, I'll turn to you now, if I may.
So I would endorse Nigel's 2 points. I knew information sharing would come up, but I do endorse what Nigel has said there. I will also come up with 2 of my own. So I think it would be really good to keep some of the real positives that we have built and are building through this experience. The 2 things that I'd really like to bank and build on for the future is, firstly, this much more real-time element of the partnership that we've got between public and private sectors. The threat evolves regularly. We need to make sure that we have that much more real-time response, both in terms of threats and planning disruptions. And then secondly, to achieve that, I think that's inevitable that we will need to consider more technology solutions to this, so that it doesn't only rely on the really good partnerships that we have and the relatively sort of old-fashioned meetings and sharing of information through email. I think to really build on the real-time element that we have started to build as a result of the Fusion Cell, we'll need to consider technology, and that is something that I think once this pandemic situation settles down a little bit, we will be able to reflect on the learnings that we've had from the Fusion Cell and how we build on those for the future.
Thanks. Because I'm struck whenever we talk about fraud, I'm struck by the size of the numbers, the magnitude of the numbers, the amounts, the prevalence, and so on. So yes, I have a colleague who describes the UK's response to financial crime as low tech or no tech, which is perhaps a bit unfair, but you get the point. David, your 2 thoughts.
Yeah, I would endorse what's already been said, and I think one of the things probably touching on there with how we're doing data resource. There is that thing about resource. Very sad, when I look at the police, certainly across the UK, but London, so many of those great officers that we brought into what is now Karen Baxter's command, leaving, and the fraudsters love that. They're doing a fantastic job. I think they're joined up. I'd love to see afterwards that this continues. I can't thank enough all the people that are joining us on that. 2 points I'd say, though, is just reiterate what I said, the transparency If after this we get ultra transparency, I'm a business owner, I work with lots of businesses, I've got no problem with showing what I haven't got. Normally it would be on company's house record, a debenture, a charge. Get it out there and publish it. It's already a precedent under the Innovate UK grants. They go right back to 2004. No harm showing that. And the second bit then is that thing of data matching. I'd like to have seen, you know, and we've said this from the fraud advisory panel when we wrote also with Spotlight and Transparency International. We would like to have seen with the economic crime strategy certain other things in there, not just financial services. The country's got lots of fabulous sectors that are vulnerable and are looking to us for change. That's what we're going out and I'm hearing. So if after this we could see those things, you know, more transparency, and I think we should, because it's government-backed money, and that will act as a deterrent.
Great, thank you very much. And Amber, as promised, the last word in here.
Thank you. And, you know, I agree with my fellow panelists, to be honest. I think the key thing out of this is intelligence sharing. I think for years we have not operated in silos exactly, but we have been very hesitant to share information. And one of the great things that has come out of this is actually seeing the more joined up approach, particularly between public and private sector. You know, we do have local authorities that are now in touch with banks and talking about these fraud issues. And I think it's almost like fraud has been a taboo subject, and actually it shouldn't be, because we are all impacted by it in one way or another. I think what is sort of really key is that, you know, fraud is ever evolving. Criminals collaborate, but actually as a kind of community, we should do the same. You know, we should also come together. And I think the work, particularly kind of with the Fusion Cell, is setting the foundations for what would be really powerful for the future. Actually, we're not operating on our own. We're not in this on our own. Actually, we are a community and we should protect each other. And the way to do that is to share intelligence, is to share data, and actually come together, not just as and when, but actually more frequently. Let's have those conversations. It's really important, because actually, you know, for instance, Dave might come across something that I have no idea about, but it's impacting all of my members. Actually, we should have that conversation, and we should be more open with sharing intelligence with each other, definitely.
Great. Good. Well, I've written down 3 words: planning, partnership, and I wanted another P, but I had to go with transparency to keep Dave happy. So look, thank you very much. Thank you, Amber, Sarah, David, and Nigel, for your contributions. Thank you to everyone who attended today, and hopefully we have managed to answer your questions, or at least as many of your questions as we could do. And thank you very much also to my colleagues who are behind the scenes working with technology, Alana and Wojtek. So with that, thank you